12th of September 1944. A Wehrmacht signals officer crouches over a folding table somewhere in the low country of the Netherlands, his torch casting a pale circle of light across a map he has no reason to distrust. It is a good map, a detailed map. The kind of precise, methodical cartography that Germany herself had produced by the millions over the preceding decades. The contour lines are clean, the grid references are exact, the roads run ruler straight between towns with familiar Flemish names. He traces his finger along what appears to be a firm country road running east through polder farmland, suitable for lorries, perhaps even for armour. He makes a note. He radios the information to his superiors. And somewhere, deep in the bowels of a requisitioned country house in Buckinghamshire, England, a man in civilian clothes allows himself a quiet smile. What the signals officer cannot know, what no one on the German side knows, is that the road he has just marked as suitable for armoured movement does not exist. Or rather, it exists on paper. It exists in the meticulous, painstaking forgeries produced by a small, strange, and almost entirely forgotten unit of British military intelligence. The road on his map runs directly into a marsh, not a shallow, navigable marsh, a deep, sucking, vehicle-swallowing marsh of the kind that the Low Countries have been hiding in their landscape for centuries. Any column of vehicles that attempts to use it will not be delayed. They will not be diverted. They will simply disappear into the ground. This is not a story about bombs or bullets. It is not a story about the dramatic conventional warfare that fills most histories of the Second World War. It is a story about paper. It is a story about ink and drafting pens and the painstaking art of making something false look more convincing than the truth. It is the story of how British intelligence turned one of humanity's oldest tools, the map, into a weapon of extraordinary subtlety and reach. And it worked. Not perfectly, not every time, and never in ways that are easy to quantify. But it worked, and the story of how deserves to be told. To understand why Britain went to the extraordinary lengths of forging enemy maps on an industrial scale, you need to understand the problem that confronted Allied planners from the very first weeks of the war. The Wehrmacht moved fast. It moved with a confidence and coordination that repeatedly stunned opponents who believed themselves prepared, and central to that speed was Germany's exceptional cartographic infrastructure. The Reich had spent the 1930s quietly building one of the finest military mapping operations in the world. The Reichsamt für Landesaufnahme, the Reich Office for Land Survey, had produced detailed topographical maps of vast regions of Europe, many of which were accurate to within meters. German officers went into battle with maps that told them where the ground was firm, where the water table rose, which lanes could bear the weight of a Panzer IV, which bridges had the clearance for a self-propelled gun. The Allies, early in the war, found themselves at a distinct disadvantage. British maps of continental Europe varied enormously in quality. Some were excellent, the product of Victorian-era surveying. Others were embarrassingly vague, little better than the kind of general atlas a schoolboy might buy from a bookshop. When British forces retreated to Dunkirk in 1940, part of the chaos of that retreat was cartographic. Units moved through countryside they could not accurately read, down roads that their maps showed differently to how they actually lay on the ground. The Germans, meanwhile, had something else. They had confidence in their maps, and confidence in military planning is everything. A commander who trusts his maps plans boldly. He commits his forces, extends his supply lines, chooses routes that his intelligence tells him are viable. That confidence was precisely the vulnerability that British intelligence began to see. If you could undermine the maps, not destroy them, not steal them, but quietly, invisibly corrupt them, You did not need to win every firefight. You simply needed the enemy to commit to a plan built on false ground. The problem, of course, was enormous. How do you get a forged map into the hands of the enemy? How do you make sure it looks authentic enough to survive scrutiny? How do you corrupt the information in ways that are damaging without being obviously impossible? These were not simple questions, and the answers that emerged came from one of the more remarkable corners of the British war effort. A unit known within the intelligence community simply as the Geographical Section, working in close collaboration with the Inter-Services Topographic Department, housed partly at Oxford and partly at a series of requisition buildings across southern England. The men and women who staffed these units were not, in the main, soldiers. They were academics, geographers, cartographers, printers, linguists. Several had worked before the war at the Ordnance Survey. Others came from publishing houses and map-making firms. A significant number were European émigrés, Germans, Austrians, Czechs, whose intimate knowledge of continental European cartographic conventions proved invaluable. They knew not just how to draw a map, but how German mapmakers drew a map. They knew the precise typefaces used by the Reichsamt. They knew the conventions for representing different classes of road, the specific shading used to indicate elevation, the exact blue used for waterways. They knew, in short, how to make something that would fool another map maker. The technical process began with genuine captured German maps, which were acquired through a variety of means, seized from prisoners, recovered from crashed aircraft, occasionally purchased through neutral intermediaries in Switzerland and Sweden. These original documents were photographed and studied with extraordinary care. Every design choice was catalogued, the paper stock was analyzed. German military maps of the period used a specific weight and texture of paper, slightly different from British equivalents, and reproduction paper was sourced or manufactured to match. The inks were tested, the printing processes were replicated. The actual alteration of geographic information was carried out by specialist draftsmen working under the supervision of cartographers who understood the operational implications of what they were changing. The guiding principle was subtlety. Dramatic errors, roads that ended abruptly in open fields, towns placed in obviously wrong positions, would be spotted immediately. The art was in changes that looked plausible. A road shifted 200 meters to the west, just far enough to take it off firm ground and onto soft. A bridge marked as carrying 10 tons when it could in fact bear 4. A woodland shown as sparse and passable when in reality it was dense enough to stop wheeled vehicles entirely. A contour line adjusted so that what appeared to be a gentle gradient was in fact a slope too steep for armor without specialist equipment. Some of the most sophisticated work involved water. The Low Countries of the Netherlands and Belgium and significant parts of northern France sit in landscapes where the relationship between land and water is ancient, complex, and constantly shifting. Much of this land has been reclaimed from the sea over centuries of dike building and drainage. The maps of these regions are therefore extraordinarily sensitive documents. A dike shown in the wrong place means a field that appears dry is actually waterlogged. A drainage channel omitted from a map means what looks like solid pasture is, in reality, intersected by a ditch that will stop a vehicle as surely as a concrete wall. The forgers became experts in this kind of environmental manipulation. They could look at a genuine survey and identify precisely where a small, invisible alteration would create maximum confusion on the ground. They could remove a drainage channel from a map and know with reasonable confidence that any unit following that map would find their vehicles bogged down in what they had expected to be open farmland. They could shift a ford marker by 300 meters and know that whoever tried to cross at the marked point would find themselves in water too deep to wade. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. It keeps the channel going and helps more of these hidden stories reach people who deserve to hear them. Getting the maps to the enemy was, in some respects, a harder problem than making them. Several channels were used, and not all of them are fully documented even now. The most direct involved planting maps on agents or on the bodies of individuals who were expected or intended to be captured. In the tradition of operations like the famous mincemeat deception, in which a corpse carrying false documents was floated ashore in Spain, forged maps were included in the document sets of various deception operations throughout the war. The logic was simple. A map found on a dead British officer or recovered from a crashed aircraft would be treated with a degree of trust that a map appearing from nowhere might not receive. A second channel ran through the double-agent network, controlled by MI5 under the codename the Double Cross System. German agents who had been turned, who were now working for Britain while pretending to still work for Germany, could pass on cartographic intelligence as a part of their normal flow of information. A turned agent reporting on British troop movements might include, almost incidentally, references to road conditions or terrain that subtly reinforced the false picture being painted by the forged maps. The two operations, the map forgery and the double agent network, were carefully coordinated to ensure they did not contradict each other. A third channel, less controlled and more dependent on fortune, involved the fog of battlefield acquisition. When German forces overran positions or captured supply dumps, they routinely collected any maps they found. British planners, aware of this, occasionally ensured that forged or altered maps were present in positions likely to be lost. The calculation was cold-blooded but logical. If we are going to lose this position anyway, the maps left behind should be working for us. The operational results of the program are genuinely difficult to assess with precision, and it would be dishonest to claim otherwise. Intelligence deception is, by its nature, one of the hardest military activities to evaluate. When a German armored column fails to advance along a particular route, it is rarely possible to say with certainty whether that failure was the result of a forged map, a genuine tactical decision, aerial interdiction, fuel shortage, or any of the 100 other variables that shape battlefield movement. The records that exist, and many remain classified or were deliberately destroyed at the war's end, speak of delays, of units reported bogged down in terrain that should have been passable, of bridge classifications that proved optimistic, of routes that consumed far more time and fuel than planning suggested they should. One of the more documented examples concerns the period around Operation Market Garden in September 1944, the audacious Allied attempt to seize a series of bridges in the Netherlands and drive into Germany. The planning for Market Garden was itself partly compromised by poor intelligence about German strength in the area, a failure of a different kind. But in the weeks preceding the operation, German forces moving through the Dutch river country were repeatedly reported to be experiencing navigational difficulties disproportionate to what the terrain should have produced. Whether altered maps contributed to this is a matter of ongoing historical debate, but the coincidence is suggestive. What is clearer is the psychological dimension. German officers in the later stages of the war began to treat their own maps with a suspicion they had never previously shown. Reports from captured officers during interrogation repeatedly reference concerns about cartographic reliability. Men who had gone to war confident in their Reichsamt surveys began to cross-reference maps against local knowledge, to question locals more carefully, to send reconnaissance ahead even when maps suggested no reconnaissance was necessary. This hesitation, this friction in the decision-making process, was exactly what the forgers had hoped to create. Every minute a German commander spent second-guessing his maps was a minute not spent fighting. When compared with equivalent German efforts in the same field, the British operation stands out for its sophistication and its scale. Germany did engage in cartographic deception, but the evidence suggests it was less systematic and less technically refined. German map forgery was largely tactical, producing false maps of specific local areas to mislead partisan groups or to misdirect specific Allied units. The British operation, at its height, was something more ambitious, an attempt to degrade the enemy's cartographic confidence across entire theatres of operation. The Americans, who came late to the intelligence war and brought enormous resources when they arrived, developed their own deception capabilities through the Office of Strategic Services. American map manipulation was less focused on forgery and more focused on the selective release of accurate maps, giving the enemy the real thing when doing so served Allied purposes, withholding it when it did not. The British approach of active falsification was something the OSS studied with interest, and elements of it influenced American deception doctrine in the post-war period. Perhaps the most telling comparison is with the German experience of receiving British altered maps. Post-war interrogations of senior Wehrmacht officers, conducted by both British and American intelligence teams, revealed a consistent theme. German logistical planning in the Western Theatre from 1943 onwards was plagued by what one officer described simply as the unreliability of available cartographic material. He was not referring to maps he knew to be British forgeries. He was referring to maps he believed were German originals. That is the measure of the program's success. The legacy of the British wartime map forgery program is difficult to trace, partly because the program itself was so carefully buried after 1945. The unit was stood down, its records partially destroyed, its members dispersed back into civilian life with instructions to say nothing. Several of the key figures, men and women who had spent years becoming the finest cartographic forgers in history, returned to work at the Ordnance Survey or in academic geography, carrying their skills and their secrets with them into quiet professional lives. The technical innovations developed during the program did not disappear, however. The understanding of how to replicate foreign cartographic conventions, how to produce a document that looked, smelled, and felt like another nation's official output, became a foundational element of the post-war signals and deception work carried out by organizations that eventually coalesced into the modern intelligence services. The specific techniques are classified, but the principles survive. The broader influence on military doctrine was more visible. The Second World War had demonstrated, conclusively, that the map was not a passive document. It was an active element of the battlefield, a tool that shaped decisions, constrained options, and could be turned against the enemy who relied upon it. This understanding informed the development of information warfare as a formal discipline in the decades that followed. The idea that you could fight not just by destroying what the enemy had, but by corrupting what the enemy believed, that you could win engagements that never took place by shaping the mental landscape in which planning occurred. This is the intellectual inheritance of the map forgers. Very few physical examples of the forged maps have survived. Several are held in private collections, their provenance uncertain. The Imperial War Museum in London holds documents relating to various deception operations, though the specific cartographic forgery program is represented more by archival reference than by surviving product. The National Archives at Kew contain files that shed partial light on the organization and methods involved, though significant material remains withheld or was never transferred from departmental records. Return, for a moment, to that signals officer in September 1944, crouching over his table in the Low Countries. Think about what his map represents, not the geography it shows, the roads and fields and watercourses, but the assumption it embodies, the assumption that the document in his hands is what it claims to be, that the world it describes corresponds to the world his lorries will drive through, his soldiers will march across, his commanders will stake their plans upon. That assumption, reasonable, natural, the kind of assumption that makes organized human activity possible, was the target. Not the man, not his equipment, not his unit, the assumption. The tiny, invisible, taken for granted belief that a map is a picture of the world and not a weapon pointed at you. The British forgers understood something that most people, even in wartime, never have cause to consider. That reality, for a decision-maker, is not the ground beneath his feet. It is the information in his hands. Change the information, and you change the reality. You don't need to move the marsh. You just need him to believe the marsh isn't there. Consider what was actually achieved in the plainest possible terms. A handful of academics and cartographers, men and women who had trained to understand the world by representing it accurately, turned that skill inside out. They became experts in accurate inaccuracy. They could produce with laboratory precision a document whose every detail whispered authenticity, while its substance whispered lies. They required no aircraft, no bombs, no ships. They required good paper, the right ink, a steady hand, and an extraordinarily clear understanding of how human beings make decisions when they believe they understand their environment. The columns that bogged down in fields that should have been firm, the bridges that broke under loads the maps said they should bear, the hours lost to routes that arrived nowhere, the commanders who hesitated, who rechecked, who sent scouts ahead on roads they should have trusted. All of this, or some portion of it, flows from those quiet rooms in Buckinghamshire and Oxford where people who loved maps spent the war learning to hate them correctly. There is something deeply, characteristically British about this. The preference for misdirection over confrontation, the faith that intelligence applied carefully is worth more than firepower applied expensively, the willingness to treat the enemy's certainty as his vulnerability rather than his strength, the understanding that the most powerful weapon is not the one that destroys what a man has, but the one that corrupts what a man knows. The signals officer folds his map. He radios his recommendation. Somewhere, the column begins to move, and somewhere in the low country of the Netherlands, a marsh waits, patient, indifferent, precisely where it has always been, to receive it. They didn't win the war with forged maps, but they helped ensure that the men fighting to win it faced an enemy who could no longer trust the ground beneath his feet. In a conflict decided by fractions of time, of resource, of confidence, that was not a small thing. That was everything.